All right, thanks for coming, everyone. So we've heard lots about exciting new technologies for social VR, OC3. We've seen lots of amazing new experiences that are being created. So I'm really happy we're also making some time at the conference to talk about keeping people safe together in VR. So I'm Jim Perbrick. I've recently been working at Facebook and Oculus, but I've also had 20 years of experience building and designing virtual worlds, including Second Life and EVE Online. So I've seen lots of people having great times in virtual worlds and also trying to make sure that people always have great times in virtual worlds. So I'm really happy we've got some amazing panelists today. I'm really happy to introduce Tony Sheng from AltspaceVR. Tony, do you want to introduce yourself and AltspaceVR?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a product manager at AltspaceVR. If you haven't used it before, it's a place to hang out with your friends and friends you make that you meet in VR. And you can do lots of different things like attend live events, play games, or just hang out. I'm responsible for coming up with great things for people to do in AltspaceVR and also to make sure that they feel safe when they're doing them.
All right, great. And also joining us today, we have Darshan and Shankar from Bigscreen. Darshan, do you want to introduce yourself and Bigscreen for people who haven't seen it?
Sure. I'm Darshan. I'm the founder and CEO of a startup called Bigscreen. We build a virtual reality application that allows you to use your computer in VR. So you see your entire computer and any apps that run on your computer in VR. So you can play games, watch videos, do anything you do on your computer in VR. But it's also social, allowing you to hang out or collaborate with colleagues inside virtual reality.
All right, great. So first of all, let's talk a little bit about the problem we're trying to solve here. So Tony, what are the most common problems you've had keeping people safe in Altspace, and how have you tackled those problems?
Yeah, I think before talking specifically about the problems, I want to mention that in Altspace, our magic moment is getting into a VR app and then feeling like you're in a room with other people. So that's really the magic there, and there are all these great things that can happen when you feel like you're there with other people. And so the problems are then the interactions you might have with those people that make you feel less safe. By far the most common is the personal space violation, and that's the same thing that makes you feel like amazed that you feel the presence of another person. It can also make you feel unsafe and uncomfortable when somebody is standing in a position that you perceive as your own personal space. And that could be somebody teleporting in front of you so that they're just a few inches away from your face, or waving their peripherals at your face, or even sticking them through you. So other forms of abuse as well, but the vast majority are personal space violations.
Okay, and same question to you, Darshan. Yeah. What are the problems you see in Bigscreen?
So on a similar note, our magic moment for Bigscreen, the social component is smaller scale, very intimate. It's 4 people per room. So the magic moment in Bigscreen is being able to have that social presence, being able to recognize that somebody else is in the room with you, but to also be able to see their screen, to see their computer and see what they're doing on their computer. So that magic moment is being able to sit side by side and collaborate or watch a movie together, do something together as though you were in the same living room or conference room together. But similarly, I think the generic problem, the problem that any social or multiplayer VR application faces is that personal space violation, is that kind of people sticking their controllers kind of too close to you. So it starts to feel like, when you have so much presence in VR and you feel like you're embodied in a virtual world and you see your hands, it feels extremely disturbing to have someone else's hand go through you. It's not a comfortable experience. So one of the things we did to tackle that problem was the personal space bubble. It's a really simple concept. We have personal space in the real world. So if objects that are not yours, so if somebody else's controller or somebody else's kind of head, it moves too close to you, we just don't render that. We don't show that to you. So that way, if someone is trying to get into your personal space, you just don't see it. That's one of the biggest things we added to just drastically increase the comfort level of using social VR. But some of the more specific problems that we encountered are screens. So because Bigscreen allows everybody to bring their own computer, their own screen into VR and share it with other people, one common problem we encountered is that people would make their screens too big. They would try to stick their screens in your face, and similar problems there. And those required much more kind of very specific methods of countering those and preventing those from ruining your experience.
Okay, so historically in virtual worlds, we've seen that women and minorities suffer a disproportionate amount of problems feeling safe. Is that something you see in AltsSpace as well?
Yeah. Unfortunately, when consumer VR released, we saw all sorts of things we didn't expect, and one of the most alarming and alarming things for the team was that we saw some sexual harassment on our platform, and women would come in and would get swarmed by a group of people. And I think there are some, the tactics, the tools that we provided are not necessarily specific to women, and they've been helpful across the board. But I think maybe what the lessons that I take away from that experience are more about the approach that we took as a team. It's kind of hard as a man to talk about the issues that women uniquely face because I can't possibly understand the nature of those experiences. But what we have is the benefit of a team with diverse perspectives, so we can all work together to listen and observe and try to understand those issues that they face, and then try to develop tools that can help address those problems. So if there's a general lesson here, it's that it's not any individual person's responsibility to make it feel safe for a diverse group of people, and it's not members of that group's responsibility to solve those problems either. It's the whole team's, and that's how we've approached it.
Okay.
Darshan, is that something you see in
Yeah.
Bigscreen as well?
The interesting thing, again, since Bigscreen is so intimate, it's 4 people inside of a room. We don't have kind of the exact same problem where 50 people kind of swarm around the second they notice, oh, someone female has joined the room. We don't have that exact same problem, and we haven't received reports yet of sexual harassment problems. But the thing that we've been doing there is by just keeping an extremely close eye and building tools that allow people to report users, building banning tools to allow us to ban users that are not behaving well on the platform, as well as just providing self-governing tools to allow people that instantly when they come in to be able to mute people, kick people, and have a better experience when something undesirable is happening. Those tools allow us to make sure that people can have a good experience when we don't have tools like there's no admin that can kind of jump into, like we can't go into rooms. We don't have moderators that can go into rooms because it's more like Skype. It's a 4-person room. So the tools we had to build there are more about self-governance to allow people themselves to report and let us know when something's going wrong. And then we can go ahead and talk to that user, ban that user if necessary, and deal with it appropriately.
Okay, so we've talked a bit about the kind of unique new problems that we're seeing with this generation of immersive VR. Historically, we've also seen problems with verbal abuse and also sharing offensive media, creating offensive content in virtual worlds, and in some cases also real-world abuse, where people will actually find the real-life identities of people and actually kind of break the magic circle and take the kind of harassment outside the virtual world and into the real world. Are these also things that you see or anticipate having to deal with?
Yeah. I think the specific issue of personal information is a big problem, is a big potential problem. It hasn't been a problem yet, but because your entire computer screen is being streamed instantly when you jump into a room, other people can see what's on your computer. You might have your emails open, your bank, your account statements. It's hard to say, whatever your personal information is. So we've been pretty careful about that to make sure that people know before they get into a multiplayer session that they know what they're getting into. So by default, Bigscreen puts you into a single player environment so that you don't immediately get thrown into a multiplayer world with random strangers. You can use Bigscreen privately or publicly, and that happens only after, allowing you to kind of get a feel for the product before you potentially reveal personal information, as well as a one-click button to just hide your screen if you just want to very quickly do something personal or private and you don't want that information to be leaked out. That's just one and probably a lot more things that we'd have to do. I'm guessing you might have had some of those as well.
Yeah. For a developer conference, I think many of the audience might be thinking, like, how do I approach safety on my platform? And the issues that we might see might be not the issues that you see. And maybe it's helpful to talk about the chronology of things we've done to help address safety and how we've addressed things that we didn't expect?
Yeah, sure. That takes us on to solving the problem, which
Yeah, sure.
what
Okay.
we're going to talk about next.
So at AltspaceVR, I think we launched when all the consumer hardware came out, but we've also been live since early 2015 in open beta. And during that time, it was developers on DK1s and DK2s, and everybody was extremely well behaved. We had an ability to report somebody for bad behavior that was almost never used, and we had these really cool interactions like our French users coming in and kissing other users on the cheek when they meet them. And we were wondering, like, are people just extraordinarily well behaved right now, or is this how it's going to be when consumer VR comes out? And as we were preparing for that, we wanted to make sure that we as a team were aligned on how we wanted people to behave on our app, what was appropriate and not appropriate. And so that first phase is really around setting expectations and coming up with tools for us to identify problems as they arise and deal with bad actors if they come. So specifically, that's a code of conduct, community standards that are published and are mentioned on the onboarding flow, and a way for users to report other users, or even just issues on the platform, and then a system for us to address those things. The big learning we had when consumer VR came out is that those tools were very helpful and helped us address problems after the fact, but they weren't immediate enough. So if you're new to the platform and something is happening, and you don't have any way to address that except for to file an abuse report after it's all over and then wait for that to be addressed before coming back in, that's definitely not enough. So immediacy was our focus on the second end, which was a lot of things that you've also mentioned. Can I mute this person? Can I block this person? And then can I make it even easier for me to block that person and then report that person to give a reason to both help me explain what happened on the platform, but also help AltSpace understand what problems are occurring. It's also worth mentioning that since the beginning, we've had full-time staff in the platform, the moderators that you were mentioning, that can go from room to room and make sure that any issues are addressed quickly. And now we're moving on to giving users the ability to enhance the experience for other users. And those are things like hosted activities feature, which we might talk about a little bit later, and the ability to own an experience and then if there are bad actors, remove those on behalf of the other users in that experience. And so altogether, over the last few months, we've seen a 90% reduction in the frequency of blocks normalized for our usage, and which we're really happy with and hope to continue to improve on.
I think that's a really interesting point that we've seen in virtual worlds previously, where because the environment is synchronous, because the communication is synchronous, on the one hand, it's not. It's definitely not enough to just have a reporting flow. You will have a reporting flow even if you've got the best reporting flow in the world. It's going to take your team, minutes at least to look into an issue, even if they're present, and understand what's going on and make a decision. And because the virtual environment is a synchronous communication medium, you need something that you can use immediately to make the bad stuff stop.
Yeah.
But also, it's interesting in Julian DeBell's book, My Tiny Life, he talks about an issue where there were these kind of muting facilities available, even in text-based virtual worlds. But there's still a lag. There's always a lag between something bad happening and you dealing with it. And so, even when you've got these kind of instantaneous mechanisms, something bad has happened. And so then he found that the community there wanted to have some follow-up afterwards, and that it wasn't enough to just say, okay, we've got facilities to mute the bad things that are happening or filter the bad things that are happening, because even if those exist, there is a moment where bad things are happening before I get the chance to mute it, and there needs to be some follow-up afterwards. So it seems to be a common pattern that you have these two things kind of existing at the same time and kind of complementing each other in some senses.
Yeah.
Right.
So Tony, I wanted to ask you a particular question about AltSpace. When I first used AltSpace, I think I got really lucky. I went into AltSpace, met some strangers. That everyone was very friendly. We had the little globe which told us where people were from, and we talked about, what's the weather like in Spain? What's the time? Is it nighttime? We had this really good conversation. And then, but also, we noticed someone coming into the environment who was obviously having some troubles. They were kind of like lying on their back and kind of writhing around, and their controllers were kind of freaking out. They didn't look like they were having a great time. And it reminded me of situations in Second Life where people would come into Second Life, they would be learning the environment, and then when they realized that they were learning in plain sight of other people, that kind of freaked people out. People were like, wait a minute, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm a complete noob. I don't want people watching me kind of stumbling around like a toddler in this new environment. People wanted a space where they could learn on their own, and then when they felt comfortable, go and join other people. Is that something you've thought about with AltspaceVR as well?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's, as I mentioned before, our magic moment is being in a room with other people and feeling like you're there. So on the one hand, we have this goal of delivering that magic moment as soon as we possibly can. On the other hand, we have this goal of making sure everybody is feeling comfortable and safe before they have that moment. So before, we were actually dropping users directly into what was at the time called the welcome space, where we had our concierge member and then all new members, and a lot of people would just come back and hang out there because it was fun. And that worked pretty well for the most part, partially because our community was so awesome that when they saw somebody writhing on the ground, they would all rush over and be like, hey, what's going on? How can we help you? And a lot of users were onboarded by other users, which is a really gratifying feeling for us and also for the user. For the reasons that you described, we introduced a loading space that is kind of a private room that you can test your mic and figure out your controls, and then actually you actively have to select to enter somewhere. So you don't have the surprise of like, oh, holy crap, there are all these people here. But this is a clear opportunity for us to improve. A survey we did just Monday actually shows that 75% of our users don't perceive that loading space as a training space. So after this conference, I'm going to go back to my desk and try to figure out how to make that a more effective experience.
Right, great. So Darshan, one of the unique problems with big screen is it's the core experience of sharing a screen. How do you think about minimizing bad experiences from either accidentally oversharing stuff that you didn't mean to share with other people, or with people being able to share things that other people don't want to see?
Yeah, it's a really tricky problem. The magic moment of big screen is also, it's kind of the tricky problem that we need to make sure we address carefully. Obscene material is so easy to pick up, find, and share when you can share your entire computer, your entire screen, anything on your computer you could share to someone. So some of the things we've had to build there are, first of all, just reporting tools. That's kind of like a very baseline thing that you should just implement as soon as possible, so that from day one, you know if somebody's having a bad experience, you can handle it. And number two is just making sure that people know what they're getting into. People know what the rules of the road are, or as you said, code of conduct. What is appropriate in here? So one of the things we have are just descriptions for each room. As a user creates a room, if it's a public room, adding a description for what are you trying to do in this room. That kind of sets the expectations for users in terms of what's going to be inside that room. And it doesn't have to be obscene material. It could just be irrelevant material. If you jump into a room and everybody's watching something on YouTube, it would be somewhat inappropriate for you to start playing random music that interrupts their social experience. So having those names and descriptions kind of sets the right tone for what people expect in terms of social behavior in that room. But the other thing is self-governance, as I mentioned before, allowing the admin of the room to say, like, this is not appropriate behavior, and to kick people from that room instantly in just one click. That's important so that the person doesn't come back into the room, keep trolling you, or keep ruining your social experience. That's probably one of the most important tools that we built, the admin functionality, giving them the power to mute users or kick users and maintain a good social experience in these small, intimate 4-person rooms.
Okay, great. And so when I first used big screen, I kind of had one of these kind of surprise moments where I kind of just sort of charged straight into the kind of social multi-user experience because I wanted to see what the social experience was like. And so maybe I just didn't read enough of the warnings, but I found myself in a multi-user space with everything open on my desktop, and I was like, wait, that's my email, that's my, like, I need to close some windows here very quickly.
Yeah. We definitely need to do a lot of work there.
There,
we had just like one pop-up.
Right. Are there automated tools? I'm wondering if there are automated tools you can use to kind of go, wait, there's a window called Gmail here.
Yeah.
You probably need to.
Definitely. So that's an interesting area of kind of research and exploration for us. We don't actually stream your desktop through our servers or anything like that in the multiplayer environments. Obviously, single player is entirely single player. It doesn't even touch our server. But for the multiplayer, the social side of things, all of the desktop streaming occurs in a completely private, encrypted, peer-to-peer manner. So there's no way for us to do, and we wouldn't want to do, any sort of server-side investigation in terms of what's on your computer screen. That would violate privacy, would be expensive, all sorts of issues there. But some interesting areas are to apply AI and ML to understand what is on your screen locally, so that you yourself can understand, okay, on your screen there's Gmail's open. Maybe you want to close that before you jump in, or just some sort of warnings by trying to determine what's running on your computer right now. And as well, we can just determine, we can apply that same technology to other people in the room. So if someone jumps into the room and we can write some code to estimate, like, is this obscene material? Is the volume too loud? We can detect some of those things in advance and potentially expose that to the user and say, hey, I think you might want to block or mute or something like that. But this is still very early. We don't know. There's a lot of experimentation we need to do there, both to make sure that we onboard users with the right expectations and the right education to make them understand you're about to show everything that's on your computer to anybody that's in this room. The onboarding is important, as well as potentially adding more functionality in the future to make sure that we prevent inadvertently sharing private info or just having a bad social experience.
Cool. So we've talked about two kind of different types of ways of dealing with this problem. One of them is broadly kind of filtering out bad stuff, so muting someone who's being offensive or building personal space bubbles. And those are kind of really nice in the sense that they only affect you, right? They only affect the person doing the filtering. And so it's difficult for them to be used as a tool for harassing people themselves. But we've also talked about areas where you have admins, people hosting, and you have mechanisms that allow you to kick people out of a room. Have you thought about, or have you had problems where people are actually using those tools that you're giving them to deal with to make the environment safe, actually being used to harass people themselves? Have you had problems with people kicking people out of rooms just for as a way of kind of abusing people?
I don't think we have had that issue quite yet, but obviously anytime you build some sort of protection tools, there's the potential for it to be used inadvertently to actually troll or to provide a bad social experience. I think for us, it's a unique situation because it's only 4 people in a room. So if you do kick someone out of your room, that's probably okay. It's probably not a big issue because you made that room, it's your room, you can control that room. We don't allow any user to kick anybody, just the person who created that room. So we haven't seen that yet. Most of our kind of features for this are things like muting other people. That won't necessarily affect other people. It can't necessarily be used to abuse other people, but there's always that possibility.
Okay. And Tony, you also mentioned that you're kind of looking at this, letting people host their own experiences and kind of run their own experiences. How do you see the kind of relationship between your kind of code of conduct, which is, this is how we expect you to behave in AltSpace, and then the kind of code of conduct or the norms or the behaviors that are enforced by the people who are hosting the experiences? Do you find that there is any tension or difficulty there? Do you find that people create spaces with particular kind of extra expectations in terms of behavior on top of the code of conduct you've provided, or how does that work?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and we haven't seen too much of it yet, but I suspect that as there are more users and more things to do, more customization of those experiences are providing, there may be some more tension between what we think is appropriate and what you and your friends might think is appropriate. I think today we have 3 tiers of experience. One is public, anybody can join it. Another is friends only, so only you and your friends can be there. And another is completely private. And the degree to which we enforce the public standards, which are in our codes of conduct, are lessened as we go from a public to friends only to private. To the point where maybe in private, we can't see anything that you're doing in a private activity or event. So that it's up to you to decide how you want that that to go. And because it's private, there are way fewer vectors for abuse. I wanted to touch on something, the previous question too, on it made me think about the features as potential vectors for abuse. Like one thing that was kind of funny is that your avatar name can be abuse, right? You can have an obscene word in your avatar name, and then that's shown to all the other users. And our system for that was to rename the name to a random color and a type of tree, so that user would just have that username going forward. But as a developer, as a small team, you don't really want to spend all your resources going in and renaming all of the users that might be doing that. And it might not be your username. It could also be the name of your event or the description that you put in. Really, any opportunity for input could be used incorrectly. And we're still working on this, but one thing that we found very effective is to design in such a way that it reduces the opportunities for somebody to do something like that. And that could be like a list of words that are not allowed, or certain fields that you can't customize, things like that. But yeah, something we're continuing to learn about, but certainly an interesting set of like light abuses.
Yeah, I think now that you actually mentioned that, I just remembered one potential vector for kind of using a tool to actually abuse is the reporting functionality. Trolling, I suppose, by reporting people that aren't doing anything wrong, trying to get them kicked off the platform. So one thing that we've done there is to actually reach out to users that get reported and have a one-to-one conversation with them and say, hey, you've got a bunch of reports for this reason, what's going on? That allows us to filter out potentially the bad reports, where the false reports, where they're not actually getting reported for anything wrong. But that's also cool, because if you are getting reported a lot, and we do have that conversation, a really cool thing happened for us where we reached out to a user that was, I think they had dozens of reports. They were not behaving well on the platform. And we permanently banned that user from creating or joining public rooms. And there's a contact email at the bottom of that. They reached out to us and they said, hey, I'm really sorry. I didn't mean to do that. I apologize. Can you let me back in? I won't do that again. That person's now a normal user and loves using the product and is now a positive member of our community. That was a really cool experience. So that's not quite about, so when people report, we have ways of talking to them and understanding what's actually happening to kind of filter out some of those false reports.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. So how do you measure how bad your problem is, and how do you measure how well you're doing? So Darshan.
Measuring is always very important to do, and I think you alluded to some of it. It's hard for us to do, but all we've been measuring are the number of reports we get to try and see, have they gone down, have they gone up? Are the tools we build helping users? As well as just closely talking directly with our community, whether it's on Twitter or Reddit, or just using our own product and jumping in and talking to our users. And we noticed a drastic drop in reports because it was typically just one or two people that were causing all the problems. And once we directly talked to them or banned them from joining a public room, the reports went down.
When we think about reporting, I think we get input from 3 different places. One is we have numbers to look at, and that's the quantitative side of things. It's important to have, and we look at it as normalized blocks. So the number of blocks in a day divided by the DAO that day are thousands of DAO. And that's the single chart that we can measure, like how well are we providing tools for users to protect themselves. And then we have, we're always talking to users to try to understand opportunities to make AltSpace better, and abuse comes up. And but a really interesting channel we have in our Slack is a feed of all of our Zendesk tickets. And not everybody has to read all of them, but I go in and read them every week. And the reports can be like, I'm having trouble changing the name of my account, but also like this user did this to me. And this doesn't help you measure how well a specific feature solved your problem, but it does help you understand what types of problems users are seeing, and what a lot of times they often suggest, if you just did this, this would help me solve my problem. And if you get enough of those, that really helps the product team prioritize what you put into the product.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about social spaces are there any particular challenges for building game-like experiences? I know AltspaceVR has some games.
Yeah, I had when we were talking about this earlier, we talked a lot about griefing, but I was thinking about this morning, and what's kind of interesting about AltspaceVR, and there might be some parallels to Oculus and other platforms, is that our games are like mini games. Like they're fun things, and they're really they're like social objects, and they're an excuse to have an experience that's social with other people. But the real meat of that experience is the interaction between the people, and probably the most. So for the game itself, there is lots written about reducing griefing and designing games so it's harder to cheat and harder to ruin the game, and we certainly do a lot of that. But a lot of our experiences are also developed by our SDK community. So we're not actually making them; they're creating these awesome experiences that other people use, and we try to help them make it hard to grief. But really, we have this platform level set of tools that we've been talking about this whole time, so that you can remove a griefer with something that is present in all of AltspaceVR. And that's something that could be really useful at a platform level for an app store. Like, maybe if I could report somebody in my game that has an impact on a user playing a different game. Yeah, so that's just what I was thinking about this morning.
Right, okay. I mean, certainly I think that there are going to be a few people who just have fun ruining other people's experience in kind of any kind of multiplayer or social experience. But I think it definitely potentially becomes harder in games where you have big rivalries that can build up. I mean, certainly if you think about EVE Online, one of its kind of defining features is that you've had groups of people who've been kind of competing with each other sometimes for years or decades, and that's part of the kind of epic part. That's a core part of the sort of epic feel of EVE Online. But it also obviously encourages people to kind of push the limits, either to get advantage over the other team, or to kind of cause problems for people on the other team. So the line between what's acceptable and what's actually what's the meta game, what's kind of an acceptable and fun amount of spying, and what's kind of creepy and not okay, is definitely a difficult one. Certainly, if you have these kind of big rivalries, if this thing you've built is incredibly meaningful for these people, right? If the conflict that is happening between these two teams is potentially incredibly meaningful for people, then it can make things even harder than in the kind of more social experiences that we've been talking about as well. Okay, great. So. We've talked about lots of ways in which you can build features. You can build machinery, you can build reporting flows to make people safe in virtual environments and VR. If you were giving advice to a developer in the audience and they were thinking about what should I prioritize, what's the most important thing they should be doing? What's the order of attack here?
Yeah, I think, well, first, is it a priority? Should I prioritize it? And I think the answer is a clear yes, and probably don't need to convince those in the room because you attended the panel. But one way to think about that is on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that the base is physiological, and the second is safety. So as soon as you get people in the app, your next concern should be, are they safe? And the safety could be of this embodied person that you identify with as yourself in a virtual space. It could also be your currency or your ships in EVE Online. Until you can make people feel safe, you can't reach the real greatness of your app, the self-actualization, so to speak, of your app. I think we all feel this pain of not having enough time or resources to do all the things that we want to do in our apps. There's really no one answer, and I think it's just remembering that it's really important, thinking of it up front, acknowledging that you're not going to identify all of the ways that your users are going to behave in your app up front, and that you're going to have to listen carefully and adapt and measure over time, and just finding ways to bake it into all of your thinking about what you're going to add to your app and how you want people to interact with your app.
I would agree with that. I think anytime you're doing any sort of multiplayer experience, whether it's a game or content or an app, you have to be thinking about it from day one. You have to release it to the public with some of these features built in. It's just such a core, I think, requirement, a fundamental requirement about doing this. And perhaps that wasn't necessarily the case in before VR, but it's definitely the case with VR because you have so much presence. You really feel like you're sitting next to somebody else. So it feels a lot worse when you have an undesirable experience and potentially in kind of magnifying how bad it could be than compared to like text or just purely verbal abuse. So I think it's important to start thinking about that from day one. And we've discussed some fairly kind of easy to implement features that you could have on day one, whether it's muting, blocking, kicking, reporting functionality. I think it's core to have all of that in any multiplayer VR experience from day one.
And this is something we talked about after we did our prep session. There's like, there are a lot of new issues in VR, but there's like a lot of great lessons to learn from 2D games that have been built and online communities that exist today. So it can feel kind of isolating to work on these problems in a new computing platform like VR, but there's this whole conference of people trying to solve these similar issues, and then you have whole industries of people that worked on not the same issues, but similar issues in different computing platforms. So I think it's a mistake to ignore all of the hard work that other people have already done and draw from those lessons as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Like there are some games now that filter out text chat. So if you try to use obscene words in text chat, it just changes the text to be something more polite. Right, there are all sorts of lessons you can take from that and definitely bring it into VR.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting issue that you've brought up there, or interesting point there, that although in some ways the kind of the competition in games makes potentially these things harder, also because things are somewhat more task-focused, potentially you can limit some of the communication and some of the freedoms in the environment because you don't need all those freedoms because you're trying to play a particular game and doing a particular thing. And I think in some cases that can help you out. For example, if you have set positions in your environment, then maybe it's more difficult for your kind of personal space bubble to get kind of interrupted by somebody else. And also if you're in a task-based environment where you're trying to achieve a game, maybe it's okay to have your text, the phrases you can use, be limited to a certain number that are applicable to your game, and therefore you can still have people working together as a team and getting that great experience of being a social, having that social presence and having that feeling of working together, the camaraderie. But then you can potentially reduce the opportunities by just reducing the kind of gamut of words and phrases that people can use. So there are certainly, you should think about, it's amazing when you give people this massive, broad spectrum of communication where people, feel like they're fully there and fully able to communicate and next to each other and, as if they're in the real world. But sometimes that isn't necessarily required, and you can make your life easier as a designer of an experience by just thinking like, is this absolutely necessary for the thing we're trying to achieve? Okay, great. We've talked a lot about keeping people safe and avoiding bad experiences. But the goal here is really to create amazing experiences for people in VR, right? We want to keep people safe, and we want to let people have amazing experiences together in VR. So, Tony, what's the most amazing experience? What's the story of the most amazing experience you've heard of people having in AltsSpace?
Well, we hear the most amazing experiences all have a shared theme of enabling people to feel closer than they are in real life or through other methods of communication. And so lots of examples here, but one that sticks out is there was a journalist who wrote an article about his long-distance relationship. His girlfriend had just moved to England for a few months, and he was in the United States, and they were just like, well, let's try VR and see if that helps us. And so they were using AltsSpace to first just find private places for them to chat. And then they started to go to, one of the funny things is that they chose their avatars, and he chose just the default, the first customization of the male avatar, and then she chose a floating orb bumblebee. And part of this, the article was like, this did not look anything like my girlfriend, but I could still feel her behind the blinking robotic eyes of this bumblebee avatar. And that's just really cool. I think people on our team work on AltsSpace for lots of different reasons, but I think we all share a desire for people to feel closer and more connected. those type of connections are happening every day in AltspaceVR and through VR, and I think that's really magical.
Great. And Darshan, what's your favorite story?
It's similar in that story. I think at Oculus Connect 2, there was a great talk where someone was talking about how someone was able to recognize their significant other just purely based on the way they moved their head. It was the same avatars. Everybody had the same avatars, but just the body language that you can communicate. So similarly for us, it's been really powerful to see how people in a very intimate, like 4-person, 3 or 4-person kind of small group inside Bigscreen had this really powerful collaborative experience. So the stories that we've seen are people sitting side by side working together. Even though they're thousands of miles away from each other, they're able to feel like they're sitting right next to each other, that social presence, and getting that body language cues of emotion, of intent, being able to, really the most powerful thing has been being able to point to somebody else's screen and be able to say, oh, right there, like, what about moving that, like 10 pixels up, or changing the color of that object over there. That kind of, those stories of powerful collaboration, of feeling like you're sitting side by side to someone is really the most powerful part that we've seen.
Great. Okay, so final question. Where is this all going to go? What new technologies are we going to see in the future that are going to help with this problem of keeping people safe? Are we going to ever solve this problem? Is it going to be, is there a point at which we're going to be done?
Well, I think we're, just from chatting with Darshan, there are so many similarities in the problems that we face. And so, for certain types of experiences, best practice will quickly emerge. And there are going to be easier ways to implement them than there are today, so it costs less for the development team to make it. Maybe some of them will be built into your game engine or the platform that you're publishing on, and that's going to be awesome. Like, I think this basic level of harassment and abuse might get solved very easily from implementing those best practices. And then there are all of these things that we can't possibly predict. I think it was interesting to hear Michael Abrash talk about how he doesn't have any predictions for content because he just doesn't, what are creative people going to make? Users are very creative. They're going to come up with ways to use our app that we can't predict. So the way to address that going forward is a lot of the things that we've talked about too, like make sure you're measuring, make sure you're listening to your users, make sure that your team knows that it's a priority to make people feel safe. Align with your team and your users on what is appropriate and what's not appropriate. And that way, when that does come, when those unexpected things do happen, then you have this supportive developer community that you can talk to and share best practices with. And then you also have an organization yourself that is prepared to deal with those new challenges.
Yeah, I agree. I think the most important takeaway is that this is an ongoing thing that you have to always keep in mind. It's not something that you implement in a week and never think about again, and now you're done. People will be creative. They will find more ways. They will find ways to take the tools that you make and then find some way to disrupt it, right? People are very creative that way. So I think it's important to just always watch how people are using a product, listen to user feedback, and it's an evolving thing. You have to constantly pay attention to it day over day.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So it sounds like maybe we'll never get to the end of this. Well, maybe we'll never win this battle, but we'll have enough magical moments along the way that they'll be worthwhile. Okay, so that's the end of the questions that I have. I'd like everyone to thank Tony and Darshan for joining us today. And we don't have any microphones, but if you want to ask questions, if you come up at the end, then we'll be answering questions at the front at the end. So thanks everyone for coming, and hopefully that was a useful session.